Imagine standing inside a cave in the hills of northern Israel roughly 13,000 years ago. There is no brewery, no glass, no metal pot, no barley fields stretching toward the horizon. Just stone mortars sunk into the rock, wild grasses gathered from the surrounding landscape, and a community of people who still live largely by hunting and gathering. Then, somehow, someone makes beer. Not modern beer. Probably not clear, golden, cold, or particularly pleasant by today's standards. But something fermented, something alcoholic, something made from cereal grains. And here is the strange part. These people may have been making it before agriculture existed. Archaeologists studying 3 stone mortars at Rakefet Cave found evidence consistent with the processing and fermentation of wheat or barley, including signs associated with malting and fermentation. The site belonged to the Natufians, semi-sedentary foragers living in the Levant before domesticated cereals became established there. The researchers proposed that the beverage was likely produced for ritual feasting around 13,000 years ago. If that interpretation is correct, it creates an uncomfortable question for the standard story of civilization. We usually imagine the sequence like this. First, humans learn to farm. Then they grow lots of grain. Then they discover what can be done with that grain. Bread, porridge, and eventually beer. But what if the order was not so neat? What if people were already experimenting with fermented grain while the grain was still wild? And what if the desire for certain foods and drinks was itself one of the pressures pushing humans toward agriculture? That does not mean beer single-handedly invented farming. The evidence cannot support anything that simple. But it does suggest that the relationship between beer, bread, grain, settlement, and agriculture may have been far more tangled than the familiar story suggests. To understand why, we have to go back to a time when a handful of wild seeds could become surprisingly important. For most of human history, wheat and barley were not crops. They were grasses. They grew where the environment allowed them to grow, scattered across landscapes that people moved through seasonally. A hunter-gatherer did not wake up in the morning and think, "I need to harvest my barley field." There was no barley field. There were patches of wild plants. And those plants presented a peculiar opportunity. Their seeds were small, nutritious, and relatively easy to collect in quantity. But turning a handful of wild grains into something useful required work. You had to gather them, separate the edible parts, crush them, cook them, and somehow make those tiny, hard seeds digestible. Grinding stones begin to appear in precisely the kind of archaeological contexts where people were processing wild plants. And the Natufians were doing much more than casually picking whatever happened to be growing nearby. They were increasingly sedentary. They processed plants intensively. They stored food. They built substantial settlements. They buried their dead in places where communities repeatedly returned. In other words, the old image of the hunter-gatherer as someone constantly wandering from place to place becomes inadequate. Some hunter-gatherers were already living surprisingly settled lives before full agriculture. And that matters because settlement changes the question. If you live in one place for much of the year, suddenly it becomes useful to make things that would have been unnecessary for a constantly moving population. Storage becomes valuable. Grinding equipment becomes valuable. Large communal meals become possible. And fermentation becomes interesting, because fermentation is one of those technologies that does not begin with a complicated machine. It begins with biology doing something humans eventually learn to exploit. Leave certain carbohydrates in the right conditions, and microorganisms begin transforming them. Sugar becomes alcohol. And grain, which does not naturally contain much simple sugar, has another trick hidden inside it. The grain can be encouraged to germinate. During germination, enzymes begin breaking stored starch into smaller sugars that a fermenting organism can use. Humans did not need to understand enzymes. They only needed to notice that certain sequences of actions produced a different result. Wet the grain. Let it change. Process it. Mix it with water. Wait, something happens. And that is where the story becomes much more interesting. Because fermentation is not really an invention in the same way that a spear or a wheel is. The chemistry was already happening in nature. Humans were learning how to control it. The first brewer may not have invented fermentation. They may simply have discovered that nature could be persuaded to work for them. Now imagine a pile of damp grain. Perhaps some has been crushed. Perhaps some has begun to germinate. Perhaps it has been sitting in a container for long enough that microorganisms have started consuming the newly available sugars. There is no thermometer, no hydrometer, no carefully selected yeast strain, no stainless steel fermentation tank. There is only smell, taste, observation, and memory. And that last one may have been the most important technology of all. Because the first useful discovery could be repeated. Someone notices that one preparation tastes different. Someone else remembers how it was made. The process changes slightly. Then someone deliberately repeats the successful version. That is the moment when an accident begins turning into technology. Not because anyone understands what yeast is, but because people understand cause and effect. This much grain, this much water, this much time, this kind of container, this kind of heat, and eventually, this makes the good stuff. The Rakevet evidence is especially intriguing because the researchers did not simply find a mysterious ancient puddle and declare it beer. They examined stone mortars through archaeological context, useware, plant remains, starch residues, and experimental reconstruction. Their interpretation is that the Natufians processed and fermented cereals, possibly producing a beer-like beverage for ritual feasting. But there is an important qualification. Archaeology rarely gives us a bottle labeled beer. Please do not open until 2026. The evidence is indirect. The exact reconstruction of what happened inside those mortars remains debated. So the responsible conclusion is not, we have found the first beer ever made. It is, we have unusually early evidence consistent with deliberate cereal fermentation and beer production. That distinction may sound small. It is not, because once we accept the uncertainty, a much bigger possibility appears. Maybe beer was not a single invention. Maybe it emerged gradually from thousands of small experiments with grains, water, heat, storage, and fermentation. And there was another reason fermented grain could have been useful. It did not necessarily begin as an intoxicant. That is one of the easiest assumptions to make today. We see beer and immediately think of alcohol. But an ancient fermented grain beverage could also be food, could contain calories. It could make nutrients from grain easier to process, could be stored for a period of time. And, perhaps most importantly, it could become something worth gathering people together for. This is where beer stops being merely a food technology. It becomes social technology. Imagine two communities that have discovered ways of processing grain. One community uses grain mostly to make ordinary meals. The other has learned how to transform some of it into a special fermented drink that takes time and cooperation to prepare. The second community now has something unusual, a product that is consumed collectively, a product that can be produced for a ceremony, a product that can help mark a burial, a seasonal gathering, a feast, or an agreement. And the archaeological context of Rakevet Cave makes this possibility especially important. The mortars were found at a Natufian burial site, and the researchers suggested the beer was associated with ritual feasting and the treatment of the dead. If so, the earliest beer we can currently trace was not necessarily somebody's prehistoric Friday night. It may have been part of a ceremony, and that changes what inventing beer means. The first beer may have mattered because of what happened around the drink, not merely because of what happened inside it. Now comes the provocative question. Could beer have helped create agriculture? The idea sounds almost ridiculous at first. Why would anyone reorganize their entire food system because they wanted a drink? But look more closely. Agriculture was an enormous commitment. Wild foods could often be gathered without planting, watering, weeding, protecting, harvesting, processing, and storing them year after year. Farming required people to invest labor now for a payoff later. So archaeologists have long asked a difficult question. Why did humans do it? There was never going to be one universal answer. Climate mattered. Population pressures mattered. Changing animal populations mattered. Settlement patterns mattered. Ecological opportunities mattered. And different regions followed different paths. The transition to agriculture in the Near East was gradual and complicated, with domestication emerging over generations rather than appearing as a single revolutionary invention. Genetic and archaeological evidence places cereal domestication roughly around 10,000 years ago, while the process leading toward it began earlier. So beer should not be promoted to the role of secret mastermind. But it could have been one ingredient in a much larger recipe. Think about what happens when a community values a particular grain. The grain becomes useful. Useful things are worth collecting. Things worth collecting are worth protecting. Things worth protecting are worth returning to. And if people begin managing those plants, even without consciously trying to invent agriculture, their behavior starts changing the plants themselves. Harvest repeatedly. Prefer certain seeds. Drop seeds near camps. Return to productive patches. Harvest at particular times. Store the best grain. Plant it again. Generation after generation, human choices begin pushing wild plants in a new direction. Agriculture does not have to begin with a farmer standing in a field thinking, "Today I shall domesticate wheat." It can begin with thousands of tiny decisions. And perhaps some of those decisions were influenced by food. Perhaps some were influenced by storage. Perhaps some were influenced by feasting. And perhaps, in some communities, fermented drinks were part of the attraction. We simply cannot isolate one cause. But the evidence forces us to keep the possibility open. Then archaeology gives us another clue. Go forward several thousand years. Now we reach the ancient Near East of the 4th millennium BCE. The world looks very different. There are cities. There is administration. There is writing. There are specialized workers. And there is beer. At Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, archaeologists found a vessel dating roughly to the late 4th millennium BCE whose residue contained calcium oxalate, commonly known as beer stone, alongside evidence consistent with ancient beer production. Chemical analyses helped identify some of the earliest securely documented beer residues known from the Near East. This is a completely different world from the Natufian hunter-gatherers. And yet the basic problem is strangely familiar. Grain, water, processing, fermentation, containers, people. Only now the process has become part of a much larger system. Beer is no longer simply something a small group can experiment with around a stone mortar. It can become an organized product. And that is when a drink begins revealing something about civilization itself. Because cities need systems. Someone has to grow the grain. Someone has to harvest it. Someone has to transport it. Someone has to process it. Someone has to brew it. Someone has to distribute it. And someone eventually has to write down who received how much. The drink that may once have begun with wild grain and accidental fermentation can become part of an administrative machine. That is a remarkable transformation. The beer has not changed only chemically. The social role has changed. This is where the popular image of ancient beer can mislead us again. Modern beer is optimized. Specific grains, specific temperatures, specific yeast, specific levels of bitterness, specific alcohol content. Ancient beer could be radically different. Could be thick, cloudy, full of suspended grain particles. Could contain other plants. Could have been sweet, sour, smoky, bitter, or slightly fermented depending on the recipe. And there was no reason for ancient brewers to care whether it resembled a modern lager. They were solving a different problem. They were taking a difficult raw material and turning it into something more useful. That makes ancient brewing less like a modern factory and more like a biological kitchen. The brewer was not commanding chemistry from a laboratory. They were negotiating with it. Too much heat and you destroy what you need. Too little and nothing useful happens. Leave the mixture too long and it changes again. The process lives in a narrow corridor between failure and success. And once humans discovered that corridor, they could begin passing it between generations. That is how an accident becomes tradition. But there is still a problem with the beer before farming idea. If people could make fermented grain drinks from wild cereals, why didn't beer immediately produce agriculture? Because it clearly didn't. The existence of early beer does not prove that humans began farming because of beer. and the archaeological record gives us plenty of reasons to resist a simple explanation. Climate shifted. The Younger Dryas brought a period of colder and drier conditions during a critical stage in the transition toward agriculture. Animal resources changed. Human populations and settlement patterns changed. Wild cereals were already abundant in parts of the Fertile Crescent. And people were experimenting with many different plants, not just barley and wheat. Agriculture was therefore not a decision with one motive. It was a response to a changing relationship between people and their environment. And this is where the story flips. Maybe the important question is not, did beer cause farming? Maybe the better question is, what kind of society would make beer valuable enough to influence behavior? Because a fermented drink becomes more useful when people gather. It becomes easier to produce when people stay near reliable plant resources. It becomes more meaningful when feasting becomes important. And it becomes economically powerful when settlements become permanent. In other words, beer may have been both a consequence of changing human society and a contributor to that change. Cause and effect begin looping back on themselves. Wild grains encourage experimentation. Experimentation produces new foods and drinks. Those foods and drinks reward settlement and cooperation. Settlement creates greater demand for grain. Greater demand encourages cultivation. Cultivation gradually changes the plants. Changed plants produce larger, more reliable harvests. And those harvests make even more intensive food production possible. No single invention starts the chain. The chain feeds itself. And then there is a place that seems almost designed to complicate the story further. Göbekli Tepe. More than 11,000 years ago, people were gathering in southeastern Anatolia to construct enormous stone monuments. The site predates the fully established agricultural societies that would later dominate the region. Its inhabitants were not simply urban farmers living inside a city. Archaeologists have found enormous quantities of animal remains associated with feasting, along with grinding equipment and large limestone vessels. Some researchers have proposed that those vessels may have been used in preparing fermented cereal beverages, based partly on chemical traces such as calcium oxalate. But the interpretation remains cautious. The vessels could have had other functions, and the evidence is not as straightforward as finding a modern brewery frozen in time. Still, the possibility is extraordinary. Imagine the sequence. People who have not yet fully transformed their landscape into agricultural farmland are gathering in large numbers. They need food. They need organization. They need cooperation. They are processing wild plants. They are feasting. They may be experimenting with fermentation. And they are building monuments that would have required enormous collective effort. The traditional story often imagines farming producing surplus, surplus producing settlement, and settlement producing monumental construction. But sites like Göbekli Tepe force us to consider whether social gathering and ritual could also have helped pull people toward more intensive food production. The direction of causality becomes difficult to draw with a straight line. And that may be the most important discovery of all. Because inventions rarely arrive alone. Beer did not appear in a world waiting for beer. It appeared inside a network of other inventions. Grinding, cooking, storage, containers, fire control, plant harvesting, seasonal knowledge, fermentation, and above all, cooperation. A person working alone can gather grain. But producing large quantities of processed food for a community requires many people. Someone gathers, someone grinds, someone cooks, someone stores, someone watches the fire, someone remembers the recipe, someone decides when it is ready. Technology becomes culture when knowledge moves from one mind into many. That may be why fermentation is such a fascinating human invention. The microorganisms were ancient. The chemistry was ancient. The ingredients were ancient. What humans invented was the relationship between them. We learned to notice, then repeat, then improve, then teach, and eventually organize entire societies around the result. So what was the first beer? We may never know. There was almost certainly no single first brewer. Somewhere, at some point, someone encountered a fermented mixture and realized that it was useful, enjoyable, nutritious, meaningful, or simply worth making again. But that person did not invent fermentation. They inherited a world already full of invisible organisms capable of transforming food. They inherited wild plants that stored energy in their seeds. They inherited fire, water, stone, and the human ability to remember what worked. The earliest brewers were therefore not inventing something from nothing. They were discovering a partnership. And that partnership would become extraordinarily powerful. Thousands of years later, in Mesopotamia, beer was woven into the economies of cities. It became a ration, commodity, a social product, a subject of writing and administration. By then, nobody needed to wonder whether fermented grain was useful. The entire system already assumed that it was. And yet the story may have started much more quietly, with a few wild seeds, a stone mortar, water, and time. So return to that cave. Return to the rough stone mortar. There is no brewery here, no farmer, no written recipe, no scientist measuring fermentation. Just a group of people standing at the edge of a transformation they could not possibly understand in chemical terms. They did not know about yeast. They did not know about enzymes. They did not know that the plants they gathered would eventually become domesticated crops. They certainly could not have imagined cities, written records, industrial breweries, or a cold beer sitting in a refrigerator thousands of years later. But they had discovered something fundamental. Food could be changed. A plant could become something else. And if you learned the sequence, you could make that transformation happen again. That is the deeper story of beer. It may not have begun with a farmer. It may not have begun with a deliberate invention. And it almost certainly did not begin with anyone trying to create the beer we know today. It began when humans stopped treating nature as something that simply happened to them. They started watching what happened, then copying it, then controlling it, and eventually building traditions, settlements, economies, and cultures around the results. The modern glass of beer looks ordinary, but hidden inside it is an ancient chain of human decisions. A wild grass gathered from a landscape, a seed transformed by heat and water, microorganisms allowed to do their invisible work, a recipe remembered, a gathering repeated, and a technology passed from one generation to the next. So perhaps the question was never simply whether beer created farming or farming created beer. The more interesting possibility is that both emerged from the same transformation. Humans learning to turn temporary opportunities in nature into permanent parts of their lives. And once we learned how to do that, a handful of wild grains was no longer just a plant. It was a possibility,